and received an acquiescence of willingness that made his heart bound. "You remember the other time I was here, I said I couldn't talk about books and things because I didn't know how? Well, I've been doing a lot of thinking ever since. I've been to the library a whole lot, but most of the books I've tackled have been over my head. Maybe I'd better begin at the beginning. I ain't never had no advantages. I've worked pretty hard ever since I was a kid, and since I've been to the library, looking with new eyes at books, and looking at new books too, I've just about concluded that I ain't been reading the right kind. You know, the books you find in cattle camps and fo'c'sles ain't the same you got in this house, for instance. Well, that's the sort of reading matter I've been accustomed to. And yet, and I ain't just making a brag of it, I've been different from the people I've herded with. Not that I'm any better than the sailors and cowpunchers I traveled with. I was cowpunching for a short time, you know, but I always liked books. Read everything I could lay my hands on, and, well, I guess I think differently from most of 'em. Now, come to what I'm driving at. I was never inside a house like this. When I come a week ago and saw all this and you and your mother and brothers and everything, well, I liked it. I'd heard about such things and read about such things in some of the books, and when I looked around at your house, why, the books come true. But the thing I'm after is I liked it. I wanted it. I want it now. I want to breathe air like you get in this house. Air that is filled with books and pictures and beautiful things, where people talk in low voices and are clean, and their thoughts are clean. The air I always breathed was mixed up with grub and house rent and scrapping and booze, and that's all they talked about, too. Why, when you was crossing the room to kiss your mother, I thought it was the most beautiful thing I ever seen. I've seen a whole lot of life, and somehow I've seen a whole lot more of it than most of them that was with me. I like to see, and I want to see more, and I want to see it different. But I ain't got to the point yet. Here it is. I want to make my way to the kind of life you have in this house. There's more in life than booze and hard work and knocking about. Now, how am I going to get it? Where do I take hold and begin? I'm willing to work my passage, you know, and I can make most men sick when it comes to hard work. Once I get started, I'll work night and day. Maybe you think it's funny, me asking you about all this. I know you're the last person in the world I ought to ask, but I don't know anybody else I could ask, unless it's Arthur. Maybe I ought to ask him. If I was—" His voice died away. His firmly planned intention had come to a halt on the verge of the horrible probability that he should have asked Arthur, and that he had made a fool of himself. Ruth did not speak immediately. She was too absorbed in striving to reconcile the stumbling, uncouth speech and its simplicity of thought with what she saw in his face. She had never looked in eyes that expressed greater power. Here was a man who could do anything, was the message she read there, and it accorded ill with the weakness of his spoken thought. And for that matter, so complex and quick was her own mind that she did not have a just appreciation of simplicity. And yet she had caught an impression of power in the very groping of this mind. It had seemed to her like a giant writhing and straining at the bonds that held him down. Her face was all sympathy when she did speak. "What you need, you realize yourself, and it is education. You should go back and finish grammar school, and then go through to high school and university." "But that takes money," he interrupted. "Oh," she cried, "I had not thought of that. But then you have relatives? Somebody who could assist you?" He shook his head. "My father and mother are dead. I've 2 sisters, one married, and the other'll get married soon, I suppose. Then I've a string of brothers. I'm the youngest, but they never helped nobody. They just knocked around over the world, looking out for number 1. The oldest died in India. 2 are in South Africa now, and another's on a whaling voyage, and one's traveling with the circus. He does trapeze work. And I guess I'm just like them. I've taken care of myself since I was 11. That's when my mother died. I've got to study by myself, I guess, and what I want to know is where to begin. I should say the first thing of all would be to get a grammar. Your grammar is—" She had intended saying awful, but she amended it to "is not particularly good." He flushed and sweated. "I know I must talk a lot of slang and words you don't understand, but then they're the only words I know how to speak. I've got other words in my mind, picked them up from books, but I can't pronounce them, so I don't use them." "It isn't what you say, so much as how you say it. You don't mind my being frank, do you? I don't want to hurt you." "No, no," he cried, while he secretly blessed her for her kindness. "Fire away. I've got to know, and I'd sooner know from you than anybody else." "Well, then, you say you was. It should be you were. You say I seen, for I saw. You use the double negative." "What's the double negative?" he demanded, then added humbly, "You see, I don't even understand your explanations." "I'm afraid I didn't explain that," she smiled. "A double negative is, let me see. Well, you say, never helped nobody. Never is a negative. Nobody is another negative. It is a rule that two negatives make a positive. Never helped nobody means that not helping nobody, they must have helped somebody." "That's pretty clear," he said. "I never thought of it before. But it don't mean they must have helped somebody, does it? Seems to me that never helped nobody just naturally fails to say whether or not they helped somebody. I never thought of it before, and I'll never say it again." She was pleased and surprised with the quickness and surety of his mind. As soon as he had got the clue, he had not only understood, but corrected her error. "You'll find it all in the grammar," she went on. "There's something else I noticed in your speech. You say don't when you shouldn't. Don't is a contradiction and stands for two words. Do you know them?" He thought a moment, then answered, "Do not." She nodded her head and said, "And you use don't when you mean does not." He was puzzled over this, and did not get it so quickly. "Give me an illustration," he asked. "Well," she puckered her brows and pursed her mouth as she thought, while he looked on and decided that her expression was most adorable. "It don't do to be hasty. Change don't to do not, and it reads, it do not do to be hasty, which is perfectly absurd." He turned it over in his mind and considered. "Doesn't it jar on your ear?" she suggested. "Can't say that it does," he replied judiciously. "Why didn't you say can't say that it do?" she queried. "That sounds wrong," he said slowly. "As for the other, I can't make up my mind. I guess my ear ain't had the training yours has." "There is no such word as ain't," she said, prettily emphatic. Martin flushed again. "And you say been for being," she continued. "Come for came, and the way you chop your endings is something dreadful." "How do you mean?" He leaned forward, feeling that he ought to get down on his knees before so marvelous a mind. "How do I chop? You don't complete the endings. A-N-D spells and. You pronounce it an. I-N-G spells ing. Sometimes you pronounce it ing, and sometimes you leave off the G. And then you slur by dropping initial letters and diphthongs. T-H-E-M spells them. You pronounce it— oh, well, it is not necessary to go over all of them. What you need is the grammar. I'll get one and show you how to begin." As she rose, there shot through his mind something that he had read in the etiquette books, and he stood up awkwardly, worrying as to whether he was doing the right thing and fearing that she might take it as a sign that he was about to go. "By the way, Mr. Eden," she called back as she was leaving the room, "what is booze? You used it several times, you know." "Oh, booze," he laughed. "It's slang. It means whiskey and beer, anything that'll make you drunk." "And another thing," she laughed back, "don't use you when you are impersonal. You is very personal, and your use of it just now was not precisely what you meant." "I don't just see that." "Why, you said just now to me, whiskey and beer, anything that will make you drunk. Make me drunk, don't you see?" "Well, it would, wouldn't it?" "Yes, of course," she smiled, "but it would be nicer not to bring me into it. Substitute one for you, and see how much better it sounds." When she returned with the grammar, she drew a chair near his. He wondered if he should have helped her with the chair, and sat down beside him. She turned the pages of the grammar, and their heads were inclined toward each other. He could hardly follow her outlining of the work he must do, so amazed was he by her delightful propinquity. But when she began to lay down the importance of conjugation, he forgot all about her. He had never heard of conjugation, and was fascinated by the glimpse he was catching into the tie ribs of language. He leaned closer to the page, and her hair touched his cheek. He had fainted but once in his life, and he thought he was going to faint again. He could scarcely breathe, and his heart was pounding the blood up into his throat and suffocating him. Never had she seemed so accessible as now. For the moment the great gulf that separated them was bridged. But there was no diminution in the loftiness of his feeling for her. She had not descended to him. It was he who had been caught up into the clouds and carried to her. His reverence for her in that moment was of the same order as religious awe and fervour. It seemed to him that he had intruded upon the Holy of Holies, and slowly and carefully he moved his head aside from the contact which thrilled him like an electric shock, and of which she had not been aware. Chapter 8. Several weeks went by, during which Martin Eden studied his grammar, reviewed the books on etiquette, and read veraculously the books that caught his fancy. Of his own class he saw nothing. The girls of the Lotus Club wondered what had become of him, and worried Jim with questions. And some of the fellows who put on the glove at Riley's were glad that Martin came no more. He made another discovery of treasure trove in the library. As the grammar had shown him the tie ribs of language, so that book showed him the tie ribs of poetry, and he began to learn metre and construction and form. Beneath the beauty he loved finding the way and wherefore of that beauty. Another modern book he found treated poetry as a representative art, treated it exhaustively, with copious illustrations from the best in literature. Never had he read fiction with so keen zest as he studied these books, and his fresh mind, untaxed for 20 years and impelled by maturity of desire, gripped hold of what he read with the virility unusual to the student mind. When he looked back now from his vantage ground, the old world he had known, the world of land and sea and ships, of sailormen and harpy women, seemed a very small world, and yet it blended in with this new world and expanded. His mind made for unity, and he was surprised when at first he began to see points of contact between the two worlds. And he was ennobled as well by the loftiness of thought and beauty he found in the books. This led him to believe more firmly than ever that up above him, in society, like Ruth and her family, all men and women thought these thoughts and lived them. Down below, where he lived, was the ignoble, and he wanted to purge himself of the ignoble that had soiled all his days, and to rise to that sublimated realm where dwelt the upper classes. All his childhood and youth had been troubled by a vague unrest. He had never known what he wanted, but he had wanted something that he had hunted vainly for until he met Ruth. And now his unrest had become sharp and painful, and he knew at last, clearly and definitely, that it was beauty and intellect and love that he must have. During those several weeks he saw Ruth half a dozen times, and each time was an added inspiration. She helped him with his English, corrected his pronunciation, and started him on arithmetic. But their intercourse was not all devoted to elementary study. He had seen too much of life, and his mind was too matured to be wholly content with fractions, cube root, parsing, and analysis. And there were times when their conversation turned on other themes. The last poetry he had read, the latest poet she had studied, and when she read aloud to him her favourite passages, he ascended to the topmost heaven of delight. Never, in all the women he had heard speak, had he heard a voice like hers. The least sound of it was a stimulus to his love, and he thrilled and throbbed with every word she uttered. It was the quality of it, the repose and the musical modulation, the soft, rich, indefinable product of culture and a gentle soul. As he listened to her, there rang in the ears of his memory the harsh cries of barbarian women and of hags, and, in lesser degrees of harshness, the strident voices of working women and of the girls of his own class. Then the chemistry of vision would begin to work, and they would troop in review across his mind, each, by contrast, multiplying Ruth's glories. Then, too, his bliss was heightened by the knowledge that her mind was comprehending what she read and was quivering with appreciation of the beauty of the written thought. She read to him much from The Princess, and often he saw her eyes swimming with tears, so finely was her aesthetic nature strung. At such moments her own emotions elevated him till he was a god, and as he gazed at her and listened, he seemed gazing on the face of life and reading its deepest secrets. And then, becoming aware of the heights of exquisite sensibility he attained, he decided that this was love, and that love was the greatest thing in the world. And in review would pass along the corridors of memory all previous thrills and burnings he had known. The drunkenness of wine, the caresses of women, the rough play and give and take of physical contests, and they seemed trivial and mean compared with this sublime ardour he now enjoyed. The situation was obscured to Ruth. She had never had any experiences of the heart. Her only experiences in such matters were of the books, where the facts of ordinary day were translated by fancy into a fairy realm of unreality. And she little knew that this rough sailor was creeping into her heart and storing there pent forces that would some day burst forth and surge through her in waves of fire. She did not know the actual fire of love. Her knowledge of love was purely theoretical, and she conceived of it as lambent flame, gentle as the fall of dew or the ripple of quiet water, and cool as the velvet dark of summer nights. Her idea of love was more that of placid affection, serving the loved one softly in an atmosphere, flower-scented and dim-lighted, of ethereal calm. She did not dream of the volcanic convulsions of love, its scorching heat and sterile wastes of parched ashes. She knew neither her own potencies, nor the potencies of the world, and the deeps of life were to her seas of illusion. The conjugal affection of her father and mother constituted her ideal of love affinity, and she looked forward some day to emerging, without shock or friction, into that same quiet sweetness of existence with a loved one. So it was that she looked upon Martin Eden as a novelty, a strange individual, and she identified with novelty and strangeness the effects he produced upon her. It was only natural. In similar ways, she had experienced unusual feelings when she looked at wild animals in the menagerie, or when she witnessed a storm of wind, or shuddered at the bright-ribbed lightning. There was something cosmic in such things, and there was something cosmic in him. He came to her breathing of large airs and great spaces. The blaze of tropic suns was in his face, and in his swelling, resilient muscles was the primordial vigour of life. He was marred and scarred by that mysterious world of rough men and rougher deeds, the outposts of which began beyond her horizon. He was untamed, wild, and in secret ways her vanity was touched by the fact that he came so mildly to her hand. Likewise, she was stirred by the common impulses to tame the wild thing. It was an unconscious impulse, and farthest from her thoughts, that her desire was to rethumb the clay of him into the likeness of her father's image, which image she believed to be the finest in the world. Nor was there any way, out of her inexperience, for her to know that the cosmic feel she caught of him was that most cosmic of things, love, which with equal power drew men and women together across the world, compelled stags to kill each other in the rutting season, and drove even the elements irresistibly to unite. His swift development was a source of surprise and interest. She detected unguessed finenesses in him that seemed to bud day by day, like flowers in congenial soil. She read Browning aloud to him, and was often puzzled by the strange interpretations he gave to mooted passages. It was beyond her to realize that, out of his experience of men and women and life, his interpretations were far more frequently correct than hers. His conceptions seemed naive to her, though she was often fired by his daring flights of comprehension, whose orbit path was so wide among the stars that she could not follow and could only sit and thrill to the impact of unguessed power. Then she played to him, no longer at him, and probed him with music that sank to depths beyond her plumb-line. His nature opened to music as a flower to the sun, and the transition was quick from his working-class ragtime and jingles to her classical display pieces that she knew nearly by heart. Yet he betrayed a democratic fondness for Wagner, and the Tannhauser overture, when she had given him the clue to it, claimed him as nothing else she played. In an immediate way, it personified his life. All his past was the Venusberg motif, while her he identified somehow with the Pilgrim's Chorus motif. And from the exalted state this elevated him too, he swept onward and upward into that vast shadow realm of spirit groping, where good and evil war eternally. Sometimes he questioned, and induced in her mind temporary doubts as to the correctness of her own definitions and conceptions of music. But her singing he did not question. It was too wholly her, and he sat always amazed at the divine melody of her pure soprano voice. And he could not help but contrast it with the weak pipings and shrill quaverings of factory girls, ill-nourished and untrained, and with the raucous shriekings from gin-cracked throats of the women of the seaport towns. She enjoyed singing and playing to him. In truth, it was the first time she had ever had a human soul to play with, and the plastic clay of him was a delight to mould, for she thought she was moulding it, and her intentions were good. Besides, it was pleasant to be with him. He did not repel her. That first repulsion had been really a fear of her undiscovered self, and the fear had gone to sleep. Though she did not know it, she had a feeling in him of proprietary right. Also, he had a tonic effect upon her. She was studying hard at the university, and it seemed to strengthen her to emerge from the dusty books and have the fresh sea breeze of his personality blow upon her. Strength was what she needed, and he gave it to her in generous measure. To come into the same room with him, or to meet him at the door, was to take heart of life. And when he had gone, she would return to her books with a keener zest and fresh store of energy. She knew her Browning, but it had never sunk into her that it was an awkward thing to play with souls. As her interest in Martin increased, the remodelling of his life became a passion with her. "There is Mr. Butler," she said one afternoon, when grammar and arithmetic and poetry had been put aside. He had comparatively no advantages at first. His father had been a bank cashier, but he lingered for years, dying of consumption in Arizona, so that when he was dead, Mr. Butler, Charles Butler he was called, found himself alone in the world. His father had come from Australia, you know, and so he had no relatives in California. He went to work in a printing office. I have heard him tell of it many times, and he got $3 a week at first. His income today is at least $30,000 a year. How did he do it? He was honest and faithful and industrious and economical. He denied himself the enjoyments that most boys indulge in. He made it a point to save so much every week, no matter what he had to do without in order to save it. Of course, he was soon earning more than $3 a week, and as his wages increased, he saved more and more. He worked in the daytime, and at night he went to night school. He had his eyes fixed always on the future. Later on, he went to night high school. When he was only 17, he was earning excellent wages at setting type. But he was ambitious. He wanted a career, not a livelihood, and he was content to make immediate sacrifices for his ultimate gain. He decided upon the law, and he entered father's office as an office boy. Think of that, and got only $4 a week. But he had learned how to be economical, and out of that $4 he went on saving money. She paused for breath, and to note how Martin was receiving it. His face was lighted up with interest in the youthful struggles of Mr. Butler, but there was a frown upon his face as well. "I'd say they was pretty hard lines for a young fellow," he remarked. $4 a week? How could he live on it? You can bet he didn't have any frills. Why, I pay $5 a week for board now, and there's nothing exciting about it. You can lay to that. He must have lived like a dog, the food he ate. "He cooked for himself," she interrupted, "on a little kerosene stove." "The food he ate must have been worse than what a sailor gets on the worst-feeding deep-water ships, than which there ain't much that can be possibly worse." "But think of him now," she cried enthusiastically. "Think of what his income affords him. His early denials are paid for 1,000-fold. Martin looked at her sharply. "There's one thing I'll bet you," he said, "and it is that Mr. Butler is nothing gay-hearted now in his fat days. He fed himself like that for years and years on a boy's stomach, and I bet his stomach's none too good now for it." Her eyes dropped before his searching gaze. "I'll bet he's got dyspepsia right now," Martin challenged. "Yes, he has," she confessed. And I bet," Martin dashed on, "that he's solemn and serious and an old owl and doesn't care a rap for a good time, for all his $30,000 a year. And I'll bet he's not particularly joyful at seeing others have a good time. Ain't I right?" She nodded her head in agreement and hastened to explain. "But he's not that type of man. By nature he is sober and serious. He always was that." "You can bet he was," Martin proclaimed. $3 a week and $4 a week, and a young boy cooking for himself on an oil burner and laying up money, working all day and studying all night, just working and never playing, never having a good time, and never learning how to have a good time. Of course, his $30,000 came along too late. His sympathetic imagination was flashing upon his inner sight all the thousands of details of the boy's existence, and of his narrow spiritual development into a $30,000 a year man. With the swiftness and wide-reaching of multitudinous thought, Charles Butler's whole life was telescoped upon his vision. "Do you know," he added, "I feel sorry for Mr. Butler. He was too young to know better, but he robbed himself of life for the sake of $30,000 a year that's clean wasted upon him. Why, 30,000 lump sum wouldn't buy for him right now what 10 cents he was laying up would have bought him when he was a kid, in the way of candy and peanuts or a seat in nigger heaven." It was just such uniqueness of points of view that startled Ruth. Not only were they new to her and contrary to her own beliefs, but she always felt in them germs of truth that threatened to unseat or modify her own convictions. Had she been 14 instead of 24, she might have been changed by them. But she was 24, conservative by nature and upbringing, and already crystallized into the cranny of life where she had been born and formed. It was true, his bizarre judgments troubled her in the moments they were uttered, but she ascribed them to his novelty of type and strangeness of living, and they were soon forgotten. Nevertheless, while she disapproved of them, the strength of her utterance and the flashing of eyes and earnestness of face that accompanied them always thrilled her and drew her toward him. She would never have guessed that this man who had come from beyond her horizon was, in such moments, flashing on beyond her horizon with wider and deeper concepts. Her own limits were the limits of her horizon, but limited minds can recognize limitations only in others. And so she felt that her outlook was very wide indeed, and that where his conflicted with hers marked his limitations. And she dreamed of helping him to see as she saw, of widening his horizon until it was identified with hers. "But I have not finished my story," she said. "He worked, so father says, as no other office boy he ever had. Mr. Butler was always eager to work. He never was late, and he was usually at the office a few minutes before his regular time. And yet he saved his time. Every spare moment was devoted to study. He studied bookkeeping and typewriting, and he paid for lessons in shorthand by dictating at night to a court reporter who needed practice. He quickly became a clerk, and he made himself invaluable. Father appreciated him and saw that he was bound to rise. It was on father's suggestion that he went to law college. He became a lawyer, and hardly was he back in the office when father took him in as a junior partner. He is a great man. He refused the United States Senate several times, and father says he could become a justice of the Supreme Court any time a vacancy occurs, if he wants to. Such a life is an inspiration to all of us. It shows us that a man with will may rise superior to his environment." "He is a great man," Martin said sincerely, but it seemed to him there was something in the recital that jarred upon his sense of beauty and life. He could not find an adequate motive in Mr. Butler's life of pinching and privation. Had he done it for love of a woman or for attainment of beauty, Martin would have understood. God's own mad lover should do anything for the kiss, but not for $30,000 a year. He was dissatisfied with Mr. Butler's career. There was something paltry about it after all. $30,000 a year was all right, but dyspepsia and inability to be humanely happy robbed such princely income of all its value. Much of this he strove to express to Ruth, and shocked her and made it clear that more remodelling was necessary. Hers was that common insularity of mind that makes human creatures believe that their colour, creed, and politics are best and right, and that other human creatures scattered over the world are less fortunately placed than they. It was the same insularity of mind that made the ancient Jew thank God he was not born a woman, and sent the modern missionary God substituting to the ends of the earth. And it made Ruth desire to shape this man from other crannies of life into the likeness of the men who lived in her particular cranny of life. Chapter 9. Back from sea, Martin Eden came, homing for California with a lover's desire. His store of money exhausted, he had shipped before the mast on the treasure-hunting schooner, and the Solomon Islands, after 8 months of failure to find treasure, had witnessed the breaking up of the expedition. The men had been paid off in Australia, and Martin had immediately shipped on a deep-water vessel for San Francisco. Not alone had those 8 months earned him enough money to stay on land for many weeks, but they had enabled him to do a great deal of studying and reading. His was the student's mind, and behind his ability to learn was the indomitability of his nature and his love for Ruth. The grammar he had taken along he went through again and again, until his unjaded brain had mastered it. He noticed the bad grammar used by his shipmates, and made a point of mentally correcting and reconstructing their crudities of speech. To his great joy, he discovered that his ear was becoming sensitive, and that he was developing grammatical nerves. A double negative jarred him like a discord, and often, from lack of practice, it was from his own lips that the jar came. His tongue refused to learn new tricks in a day. After he had been through the grammar repeatedly, he took up the dictionary and added 20 words a day to his vocabulary. He found that this was no light task, and at wheel or lookout he steadily went over and over his lengthening list of pronunciations and definitions, while he invariably memorized himself to sleep. Never did anything. If I were, and those things, were phrases with many variations that he repeated under his breath in order to accustom his tongue to the language spoken by Ruth. And ing, with the D and G pronounced emphatically, he went over thousands of times, and to his surprise, he noticed that he was beginning to speak cleaner and more correct English than the officers themselves and the gentlemen adventurers in the cabin who had financed the expedition. The captain was a fishy-eyed Norwegian who somehow had fallen into possession of a complete Shakespeare, which he never read, and Martin had washed his clothes for him and in return been permitted to access the previous volumes. For a time, so steeped was he in the plays and in the many favourite passages that impressed themselves almost without effort on his brain, that all the world seemed to shape itself into forms of Elizabethan tragedy or comedy, and his very thoughts were in blank verse. It trained his ear and gave him a fine appreciation for noble English. Withal, it introduced into his mind much that was archaic and obsolete. The 8 months had been well spent, and, in addition to what he had learned of right speaking and high thinking, he had learned much of himself. Along with his humbleness, because he knew so little, there arose a conviction of power. He felt a sharp gradation between himself and his shipmates, and was wise enough to realize that the difference lay in potentiality rather than achievement. What he could do, they could do, but within him he felt a confused ferment working that told him there was more in him than he had done. He was tortured by the exquisite beauty of the world and wished that Ruth was there to share it with him. He decided that he would describe to her many of the bits of South Sea beauty. The creative spirit in him flamed up at the thought and urged that he recreate this beauty for a wider audience than Ruth. And then, in splendour and glory, came the great idea. He would write. He would be one of the eyes through which the world saw, one of the ears through which it heard, one of the hearts through which it felt. He would write everything, poetry and prose, fiction and description, and plays like Shakespeare. There was career and the way to win Ruth. The men of literature were the world's giants, and he conceived them to be far finer than the Mr. Butlers who earned 30,000 a year and could be Supreme Court justices if they wanted to. Once the idea had germinated, it mastered him, and the return voyage to San Francisco was like a dream. He was drunken with unguessed power and felt that he could do anything. In the midst of the great and lonely sea, he gained perspective. Clearly, and for the first time, he saw Ruth and her world. It was all visualized in his mind as a concrete thing which he could take up in his 2 hands and turn around and about and examine. There was much that was dim and nebulous in that world, but he saw it as a whole and not in detail, and he saw also the way to master it, to write. The thought was fire in him. He would begin as soon as he got back. The first thing he would do would be to describe the voyage of the treasure hunters. He would sell it to some San Francisco newspaper. He would not tell Ruth anything about it, and she would be surprised and pleased when she saw his name in print. While he wrote, he could go on studying. There were 24 hours in each day. He was invincible. He knew how to work, and the citadels would go down before him. He would not have to go to sea again as a sailor, and for the instant he caught a vision of a steam yacht. There were other writers who possessed steam yachts. Of course, he cautioned himself, it would be slow succeeding at first, and for a time he would be content to earn enough money by his writing to enable him to go on studying. And then, after some time, a very indeterminate time, when he had learned and prepared himself, he would write the great things and his name would be on all men's lips. But greater than that, infinitely greater and greatest of all, he would have proved himself worthy of Ruth. Fame was all very well, but it was for Ruth that his splendid dream arose. He was not a fame-monger, but merely one of God's mad lovers. Arrived in Oakland with his snug payday in his pocket, he took up his old room at Bernard Higginbotham's and set to work. He did not even let Ruth know he was back. He would go and see her when he finished the article on the treasure hunters. It was not so difficult to abstain from seeing her because of the violent heat of creative fever that burned in him. Besides, the very article he was writing would bring her nearer to him. He did not know how long an article he should write, but he counted the words in a double-paged article in the Sunday supplement of the San Francisco Examiner, and guided himself by that. 3 days at white heat completed his narrative, but when he had copied it carefully in a large scrawl that was easy to read, he learned from a rhetoric he picked up in the library that there were such things as paragraphs and quotation marks. He had never thought of such things before, and he promptly set to work writing the article over, referring continually to the pages of the rhetoric and learning more in a day about composition than the average schoolboy in a year. When he had copied the article a second time and rolled it up carefully, he read in a newspaper an item on hints to beginners, and discovered the iron law that manuscripts should never be rolled, and that they should be written on one side of the paper. He had violated the law on both counts. Also, he learned from the item that first-class papers paid a minimum of $10 a column. So, while he copied the manuscript a third time, he consoled himself by multiplying 10 columns by $10. The product was always the same, $100, and he decided that that was better than seafaring. If it hadn't been for his blunders, he would have finished the article in 3 days. $100 in 3 days. It would have taken him 3 months and longer on the sea to earn a similar amount. A man was a fool to go to sea when he could write, he concluded, though the money in itself meant nothing to him. Its value was in the liberty it would get him, the presentable garments it would buy him, all of which would bring him nearer, swiftly nearer, to the slender, pale girl who had turned his life back upon itself and given him inspiration. He mailed the manuscript in a flat envelope and addressed it to the editor of the San Francisco Examiner. He had an idea that anything accepted by a paper was published immediately, and as he had sent the manuscript in on Friday, he expected it to come out on the following Sunday. He conceived that it would be fine to let that event apprise Ruth of his return. Then, Sunday afternoon, he would call and see her. In the meantime, he was occupied by another idea, which he prided himself upon as being a particularly sane, careful, and modest idea. He would write an adventure story for boys and sell it to the Youth's Companion. He went to the free reading room and looked through the files of the Youth's Companion. Serial stories, he found, were usually published in that weekly in 5 installments of about 3,000 words each. He discovered several serials that ran into 7 installments, and decided to write one of that length. He had been on a whaling voyage in the Arctic once, a voyage that was to have been for 3 years, and which had terminated in shipwreck at the end of 6 months. While his imagination was fanciful, even fantastic at times, he had a basic love of reality that compelled him to write about the things he knew. He knew whaling, and out of the real materials of his knowledge he proceeded to manufacture the fictitious adventures of the 2 boys he intended to use as joint heroes. It was easy work, he decided on Saturday evening. He had completed on that day the first installment of 3,000 words, much to the amusement of Jim and to the open derision of Mr. Higginbotham, who sneered throughout mealtime at the literary person they had discovered in the family. Martin contented himself by picturing his brother-in-law's surprise on Sunday morning when he opened his Examiner and saw the article on the treasure hunters. Early that morning he was out himself to the front door, nervously racing through the many-sheeted newspaper. He went through it a second time, very carefully, then folded it up and left it where he had found it. He was glad he had not told anyone about his article. On second thought, he concluded that he had been wrong about the speed with which things found their way into newspaper columns. Besides, there had not been any news value in his article, and most likely the editor would write to him about it first. After breakfast, he went on with his serial. The words flowed from his pen, though he broke off from the writing frequently to look up definitions in the dictionary or to refer to the rhetoric. He often read or reread a chapter at a time during such pauses, and he consoled himself that while he was not writing the great things he felt to be in him, he was learning composition at any rate, and training himself to shape up and express his thoughts. He toiled on till dark, when he went out to the reading room and explored magazines and weeklies until the place closed at 10 o'clock. This was his programme for a week. Each day he did 3,000 words, and each evening he puzzled his way through the magazines, taking note of the stories, articles, and poems that editors saw fit to publish. One thing was certain. What these multitudinous writers did, he could do, and only give him time and he would do what they could not do. He was cheered to read in Book News, in a paragraph on the payment of magazine writers, not that Rudyard Kipling received $1 per word, but that the minimum rate paid by first-class magazines was 2 cents a word. The Youth's Companion was certainly first class, and at that rate the 3,000 words he had written that day would bring him $60. 2 months' wages on the sea. On Friday night he finished the serial, 21,000 words long. At 2 cents a word, he calculated, that would bring him $420. Not a bad week's work. It was more money than he had ever possessed at one time. He did not know how he could spend it all. He had tapped a gold mine. Where this came from, he could always get more. He planned to buy some more clothes, to subscribe to many magazines, and to buy dozens of reference books that at present he was compelled to go to the library to consult. And still there was a large portion of the $420 unspent. This worried him until the thought came to him of hiring a servant for Gertrude and of buying a bicycle for Marion. He mailed the bulky manuscript to the Youth's Companion, and on Saturday afternoon, after having planned an article on pearl diving, he went to see Ruth. He had telephoned, and she went herself to greet him at the door. The old familiar blaze of health rushed out from him and struck her like a blow. It seemed to enter into her body and course through her veins in a liquid glow, and to set her quivering with its imparted strength. He flushed warmly as he took her hand and looked into her blue eyes, but the fresh bronze of 8 months of sun hid the flush, though it did not protect the neck from the gnawing chafe of the stiff collar. She noted the red line of it with amusement, which quickly vanished as she glanced at his clothes. They really fitted him. It was his first made-to-order suit, and he seemed slimmer and better modelled. In addition, his cloth cap had been replaced by a soft hat, which she commanded him to put on and then complimented him on his appearance. She did not remember when she had felt so happy. This change in him was her handiwork, and she was proud of it and fired with ambition further to help him. But the most radical change of all, and the one that pleased her most, was the change in his speech. Not only did he speak more correctly, but he spoke more easily, and there were many new words in his vocabulary. When he grew excited or enthusiastic, however, he dropped back into the old slurring and the dropping off of final consonants. Also, there was an awkward hesitancy at times as he essayed the new words he had learned. On the other hand, along with his ease of expression, he displayed a lightness and facetiousness of thought that delighted her. It was his old spirit of humour and badinage that had made him a favourite in his own class, but which he had hitherto been unable to use in her presence through lack of words and training. He was just beginning to orientate himself and to feel that he was not wholly an intruder. But he was very tentative, fastidiously so, letting Ruth set the pace of sprightliness and fancy, keeping up with her but never daring to go beyond her. He told her of what he had been doing, and of his plan to write for a livelihood and of going on with his studies. But he was disappointed at her lack of approval. She did not think much of his plan. "You see," she said frankly, "writing must be a trade, like anything else. Not that I know anything about it, of course. I only bring common judgment to bear. You couldn't hope to be a blacksmith without spending 3 years at learning the trade. Or is it 5 years? Now, writers are so much better paid than those blacksmiths that there must be ever so many more men who would like to write, who try to write. But then, may not I be peculiarly constituted to write?" he queried, secretly exulting at the language he had used, his swift imagination throwing the whole scene and atmosphere upon a vast screen along with 1,000 other scenes from his life, scenes that were rough and raw, gross and bestial. The whole composite vision was achieved with the speed of light, producing no pause in the conversation nor interrupting his calm train of thought. On the screen of his imagination he saw himself and this sweet and beautiful girl facing each other and conversing in good English in a room of books and paintings and tone and culture, and all illuminated by a bright light of steadfast brilliance, while ranged about and fading away to the remote edges of the screen were antithetical scenes, each scene a picture, and he, the onlooker, free to look at will upon what he wished. He saw these other scenes through drifting vapours and swirls of sullen fog, dissolving before shafts of red and garish light. He saw cowboys at the bar drinking fierce whiskey, the air filled with obscenity and ribald language, and he saw himself with them drinking and cursing with the wildest, or sitting at a table with them, under smoking kerosene lamps, while the chips clicked and clattered and the cards were dealt around. He saw himself stripped to the waist, with naked fists, fighting his great fight with Liverpool Red in the forecastle of the Susquehanna, and he saw the bloody deck of the John Rogers, that grey morning of attempted mutiny, the mate kicking in death throes on the main hatch, the revolver in the old man's hand spitting fire and smoke, the men with passion-wrenched faces of brutes screaming vile blasphemies and falling about him. And then he returned to the central scene, calm and clean in the steadfast light, where Ruth sat and talked with him amid books and paintings. And he saw the grand piano upon which she would later play to him, and he heard the echoes of his own select and correct words. But then, may I not be peculiarly constituted to write? But no matter how peculiarly constituted a man may be for blacksmithing, she was laughing, I never heard of one becoming a blacksmith without first serving his apprenticeship. What would you advise? He asked, And don't forget that I feel in me this capacity to write. I can't explain it. I just know that it is in me. You must get a thorough education, was the answer, whether or not you ultimately become a writer. This education is indispensable for whatever career you select, and it must not be slipshod or sketchy. You should go to high school. Yes, he began, but she interrupted with an afterthought. Of course, you could go on with your writing too. I would have to, he said grimly. Why? She looked at him, prettily puzzled, for she did not quite like the persistence with which he clung to his notion. Because, without writing, there wouldn't be any high school. I must live and buy books and clothes, you know. I had forgotten that, she laughed. Why weren't you born with an income? I'd rather have good health and imagination, he answered. I can make good on the income, but the other things have to be made good for, he almost said, you, then amended his sentence to, have to be made good for one. Don't say make good, she cried, sweetly petulant. It's slang, and it's horrid. He flushed and stammered. That's right, and I only wish you'd correct me every time. I'd like to, she said haltingly. You have so much in you that it's good that I want to see you perfect. He was clay in her hands immediately, as passionately desirous of being moulded by her as she was desirous of shaping him into the image of her ideal man. And when she pointed out the opportuneness of the time, that the entrance examinations to high school began on the following Monday, he promptly volunteered that he would take them. Then she played and sang to him, while he gazed with hungry yearning at her, drinking in her loveliness and marvelling that there should not be 100 suitors listening there and longing for her as he listened and longed. Chapter 10. He stopped to dinner that evening and, much to Ruth's satisfaction, made a favourable impression on her father. They talked about the sea as a career, a subject which Martin had at his finger ends, and Mr. Morse remarked afterward that he seemed a very clear-headed young man. In his avoidance of slang and his search after right words, Martin was compelled to talk slowly, which enabled him to find the best thoughts that were in him. He was more at ease than that first night at dinner nearly a year before, and his shyness and modesty even commended him to Mrs. Morse, who was pleased at his manifest improvement. "He is the first man that ever drew passing notice from Ruth," she told her husband. "She has been so singularly backward where men are concerned that I have been worried greatly." Mr. Morse looked at his wife curiously. "You mean to use this young sailor to wake her up?" he questioned. "I mean that she is not to die an old maid if I can help it," was the answer. "If this young Eden can arouse her interest in mankind in general, it will be a good thing." "A very good thing," he commented. "But suppose, and we must suppose sometimes, my dear, suppose he arouses her interest too particularly in him." "Impossible," Mrs. Morse laughed. "She is 3 years older than he, and besides, it is impossible. Nothing will ever come of it. Trust that to me." And so Martin's role was arranged for him, while he, led on by Arthur and Norman, was meditating an extravagance. They were going out for a ride into the hills Sunday morning on their wheels, which did not interest Martin until he learned that Ruth, too, rode a wheel and was going along. He did not ride nor own a wheel, but if Ruth rode, it was up to him to begin, was his decision. And when he said good night, he stopped at the cyclery on his way home and spent $40 for a wheel. It was more than a month's hard-earned wages, and it reduced his stock of money amazingly. But when he added the $100 he was to receive from the examiner to the $420 that was the least the youth's companion could pay him, he felt that he had reduced the perplexity the unwanted amount of money had caused him. Nor did he mind, in the course of learning to ride the wheel home, the fact that he ruined his suit of clothes. He caught the tailor by telephone that night from Mr. Higginbotham's store and ordered another suit. Then he carried the wheel up the narrow stairway that clung like a fire escape to the rear wall of the building, and when he had moved his bed out from the wall, found there was just space enough in the small room for himself and the wheel. Sunday he had intended to devote to studying for the high school examination, but the pearl diving article lured him away, and he spent the day in the white-hot fever of recreating the beauty and romance that burdened in him. The fact that the Examiner of that morning had failed to publish his treasure-hunting article did not dash his spirits. He was at too great a height for that, and having been deaf to a twice-repeated summons, he went without the heavy Sunday dinner with which Mr. Higginbotham invariably graced his table. To Mr. Higginbotham, such a dinner was advertisement of his worldly achievement and prosperity, and he honoured it by delivering platitudinous sermonities upon American institutions and the opportunity said institutions gave to any hard-working man to rise. The rise in his case, which he pointed out unfailingly, being from a grocer's clerk to the ownership of Higginbotham's cash store. Martin Eden looked with a sigh at his unfinished pearl diving on Monday morning, and took the car down to Oakland to the high school. And when, days later, he applied for the results of his examinations, he learned that he had failed in everything save grammar. "Your grammar is excellent," Professor Hilton informed him, staring at him through heavy spectacles. "But you know nothing, positively nothing, in the other branches, and your United States history is abominable. There is no other word for it. Abominable. I should advise you—" Professor Hilton paused and glared at him, unsympathetic and unimaginative as one of his own test tubes. He was professor of physics in the high school, possessor of a large family, a meagre salary, and a select fund of parrot-learned knowledge. "Yes, sir," Martin said humbly, wishing somehow that the man at the desk in the library was in Professor Hilton's place just then. "And I should advise you to go back to the grammar school for at least 2 years. Good day." Martin was not deeply affected by his failure, though he was surprised at Ruth's shocked expression when he told her Professor Hilton's advice. Her disappointment was so evident that he was sorry he had failed, but chiefly so for her sake. "You see, I was right," she said. "You know far more than any of the students entering high school, and yet you can't pass the examinations. It is because what education you have is fragmentary, sketchy. You need the discipline of study, such as only skilled teachers can give you. You must be thoroughly grounded. Professor Hilton is right, and if I were you, I'd go to night school. 1.5 years of it might enable you to catch up that additional 6 months. Besides, that would leave you your days in which to write, or if you could not make your living by pen, you would have your days in which to work in some position." "But if my days are taken up with work and my nights with school, when am I going to see you?" was Martin's first thought, though he refrained from uttering it. Instead, he said, "It seems so babyish for me to be going to night school, but I wouldn't mind that if I thought it would pay. But I don't think it will pay. I can do the work quicker than they can teach me. It would be a loss of time." He thought of her and his desire to have her. "And I can't afford the time. I haven't the time to spare, in fact." "There is so much that is necessary." She looked at him gently, and he was a brute to oppose her. "Physics and chemistry, you can't do them without laboratory study, and you'll find algebra and geometry almost hopeless without instruction. You need the skilled teachers, the specialists in the art of imparting knowledge." He was silent for a minute, casting about for the least vainglorious way in which to express himself. "Please don't think I'm bragging," he began. "I don't intend it that way at all, but I have a feeling that I am what I may call a natural student. I can study by myself. I take to it kindly, like a duck to water. You see yourself what I did with grammar, and I've learned much of other things. You would never dream how much. And I'm only getting started. Wait till I get—" He hesitated and assured himself of the pronunciation before he said, "Momentum. I'm getting my first real feel of things now. I'm beginning to size up the situation." "Please don't say size up," she interrupted. "To get a line on things," he hastily amended. "That doesn't mean anything in correct English," she objected. He floundered for a fresh start. "What I'm driving at is that I'm beginning to get the lay of the land." Out of pity, she forbore and went on. "Knowledge seems to me like a chart room. Whenever I go into the library, I am impressed that way. The part played by teachers is to teach the students the contents of the chart room in a systematic way. The teachers are guides to the chart room, that's all. It's not something that they have in their own heads. They don't make it up, don't create it. It's all in the chart room, and they know their way about in it. And it's their business to show the place to strangers who might else get lost. Now, I don't get lost easily. I have the bump of location. I usually know where I'm at. What's wrong now?" "Don't say where I'm at." "That's right," he said gratefully. "Where I am." "But where am I at? I mean, where am I?" "Oh, yes, in the chart room." "Well, some persons, she corrected. "Some persons need guides. Most persons do. But I think I can get along without them. I've spent a lot of time in the chart room now, and I'm on the edge of knowing my way about. What charts I want to refer to, what coasts I want to explore. And from the way I line it up, I'll explore a whole lot more quickly by myself. The speed of a fleet, you know, is the speed of the slowest ship, and the speed of the teachers is affected the same way. They can't go any faster than the ruck of their scholars, and I can set a faster pace for myself than they set for a whole schoolroom." "He travels the fastest who travels alone," she quoted at him. "But I'd rather travel faster with you just the same," was what he wanted to blurt out, as he caught a vision of a world without end of sunlit spaces and starry voids through which he drifted with her, his arm around her, her pale gold hair blowing about his face. In the same instant, he was aware of the pitiful inadequacy of speech. God, if he could so frame words that she could see what he then saw, and he felt the stir in him, like a throe of yearning pain, and the desire to paint these visions that flashed unsummoned on the mirror of his mind. Ah, that was it. He caught at the hem of the secret. It was the very thing that the great writers and master poets did. That was why they were giants. They knew how to express what they thought, and felt, and saw. Dogs asleep in the sun often whined and barked, but they were unable to tell what they saw that made them whine and bark. He had often wondered what it was, and that was all he was, a dog asleep in the sun. He saw noble and beautiful visions, but he could only whine and bark at Ruth. But he would cease sleeping in the sun. He would stand up with open eyes, and he would struggle and toil and learn until, with eyes unblinded and tongue untied, he could share with her his visioned wealth. Other men had discovered the trick of expression, of making words obedient servitors, and of making combinations of words mean more than the sum of their separate meanings. He was stirred profoundly by the passing glimpse at the secret, and he was again caught up in the vision of sunlit spaces and starry voids, until it came to him that it was very quiet, and he saw Ruth regarding him with an amused expression and a smile in her eyes. "I have had a great visioning," he said, and at the sound of his words in his own ears his heart gave a leap. Where had those words come from? They had adequately expressed the pause his vision had put in the conversation. It was a miracle. Never had he so loftily framed a lofty thought, but never had he attempted to frame lofty thoughts in words. That was it. That explained it. He had never tried. But Swinburne had, and Tennyson, and Kipling, and all the other poets. His mind flashed on his pearl diving. He had never dared the big things, the spirit of the beauty that was a fire in him. That article would be a different thing when he was done with it. He was appalled by the vastness of the beauty that rightfully belonged in it. And again his mind flashed and dared, and he demanded of himself why he could not chant that beauty in noble verse, as the great poets did. And there was all the mysterious delight and spiritual wonder of his love for Ruth. Why could he not chant that too, as the poets did? They had sung of love. So would he. By God! And in his frightened ears he heard his exclamation echoing. Carried away, he had breathed it aloud. The blood surged into his face, wave upon wave, mastering the bronze of it till the blush of shame flaunted itself from collar rim to the roots of his hair. I beg your pardon," he stammered. "I was thinking." "It sounded as if you were praying," she said bravely, but she felt herself inside to be withering and shrinking. It was the first time she had heard an oath from the lips of a man she knew, and she was shocked. Not merely as a matter of principle and training, but shocked in spirit by this rough blast of life in the garden of her sheltered maidenhood. But she forgave, and with surprise at the ease of her forgiveness. Somehow it was not so difficult to forgive him anything. He had not had a chance to be as other men, and he was trying so hard, and succeeding too. It never entered her head that there could be any other reason for her being kindly disposed toward him. She was tenderly disposed toward him, but she did not know it. She had no way of knowing it. The placid poise of 24 years without a single love affair did not fit her with a keen perception of her own feelings, and she, who had never warmed to actual love, was unaware that she was warming now. Chapter 11. Martin went back to his pearl-diving article, which would have been finished sooner if it had not been broken in upon so frequently by his attempts to write poetry. His poems were love poems, inspired by Ruth, but they were never completed. Not in a day could he learn to chant in noble verse. Rhyme and metre and structure were serious enough in themselves, but there was, over and beyond them, an intangible and evasive something that he caught in all great poetry, but which he could not catch and imprison in his own. It was the elusive spirit of poetry itself that he sensed and sought after, but could not capture. It seemed a glow to him, a warm and trailing vapour, ever beyond his reaching, though sometimes he was rewarded by catching at shreds of it, and weaving them into phrases that echoed in his brain with haunting notes, or drifted across his vision in misty wafture of unseen beauty. It was baffling. He ached with desire to express, and could but gibber prosaically as everybody gibbered. He read his fragments aloud. The metre marched along on perfect feet, and the rhyme pounded a longer and equally faultless rhythm. But the glow and high exultation that he felt within were lacking. He could not understand, and time and again, in despair, defeated and depressed, he returned to his article. Prose was certainly an easier medium. Following the pearl diving, he wrote an article on the sea as a career, another on turtle catching, and a third on the northeast trades. Then he tried, as an experiment, a short story. And before he broke his stride, he had finished 6 short stories and dispatched them to various magazines. He wrote prolifically, intensely, from morning till night and late at night, except when he broke off to go to the reading room, draw books from the library, or to call on Ruth. He was profoundly happy. Life was pitched high. He was in a fever that never broke. The joy of creation that is supposed to belong to the gods was his. All the life about him, the odours of stale vegetables and soapsuds, the slatternly form of his sister, and the jeering face of Mr. Higginbotham, was a dream. The real world was in his mind, and the stories he wrote were so many pieces of reality out of his mind. The days were too short. There was so much he wanted to study. He cut his sleep down to 5 hours and found that he could get along upon it. He tried 4 hours and a half and regretfully came back to 5. He could joyfully have spent all his waking hours upon any one of his pursuits. It was with regret that he ceased from writing to study, that he ceased from study to go to the library, that he tore himself away from that chart-room of knowledge, or from the magazines in the reading-room that were filled with the secrets of writers who succeeded in selling their wares. It was like severing heartstrings when he was with Ruth, to stand up and go, and he scorched through the dark streets so as to get home to his books at the least possible expense of time. And hardest of all was it to shut up the algebra or physics, put notebook and pencil aside, and close his tired eyes in sleep. He hated the thought of ceasing to live, even for so short a time, and his sole consolation was that the alarm clock was set 5 hours ahead. He would lose only 5 hours anyway, and then the jangling bell would jerk him out of unconsciousness, and he would have before him another glorious day of 19 hours. In the meantime, the weeks were passing. His money was ebbing low, and there was no money coming in. A month after he had mailed it, the adventure serial for boys was returned to him by the youth's companion. The rejection slip was so tactfully worded that he felt kindly toward the editor. But he did not feel so kindly toward the editor of the San Francisco Examiner. After waiting 2 whole weeks, Martin had written to him. A week later, he wrote again. At the end of the month, he went over to San Francisco and personally called upon the editor. But he did not meet that exalted personage. Thanks to a Cerberus of an office boy of tender years and red hair who guarded the portals. At the end of the 5th week, the manuscript came back to him by mail without comment. There was no rejection slip, no explanation, nothing. In the same way, his other articles were tied up with the other leading San Francisco papers. When he recovered them, he sent them to the magazines in the East, from which they were returned more promptly, accompanied always by the printed rejection slips. The short stories were returned in similar fashion. He read them over and over, and liked them so much that he could not puzzle out the cause of their rejection, until one day he read in a newspaper that manuscripts should always be typewritten. That explained it. Of course, editors were so busy that they could not afford the time and strain of reading handwriting. Martin rented a typewriter and spent a day mastering the machine. Each day he typed what he composed, and he typed his earlier manuscripts as fast as they were returned to him. He was surprised when the typed ones began to come back. His jaw seemed to become squarer, his chin more aggressive, and he bundled the manuscripts off to new editors. The thought came to him that he was not a good judge of his own work. He tried it out on Gertrude. He read his stories aloud to her. Her eyes glistened, and she looked at him proudly as she said, "Ain't it grand? You writing those sort of things?" Yes, he demanded impatiently. "But the story, how did you like it?" "Just grand," was the reply. "Just grand, and thrilling, too. I was all worked up." He could see that her mind was not clear. The perplexity was strong in her good-natured face, so he waited. "But say, Mart," after a long pause, "how did it end? Did that young man who spoke highfalutin get her?" And after he had explained the end, which he thought he had made artistically obvious, she would say, "That's what I wanted to know. Why didn't you write it that way in the story?" One thing he learned after he had read her a number of stories, namely that she liked happy endings. "That story was perfectly grand," she announced, straightening up from the washtub with a tired sigh and wiping the sweat from her forehead with a red, steamy hand. "But it makes me sad. I want to cry. There is too many sad things in the world anyway. It makes me happy to think about happy things. Now, if he'd married her and— You don't mind, Mart?" she queried apprehensively. "I just happened to feel that way because I'm tired, I guess. But the story was grand, just the same. Perfectly grand. Where are you going to sell it?" "That's a horse of another color," he laughed. "But if you did sell it, what do you think you'd get for it?" "Oh, $100. That would be the least, the way prices go." "My, I do hope you'll sell it." "Easy money, huh?" Then he added proudly, "I wrote it in 2 days. That's $50 a day." He longed to read his stories to Ruth, but did not dare. He would wait till some were published, he decided. Then she would understand what he had been working for. In the meantime, he toiled on. Never had the spirit of adventure lured him more strongly than on this amazing exploration of the realm of mind. He bought the textbooks on physics and chemistry and, along with his algebra, worked out problems and demonstrations. He took the laboratory proofs on faith, and his intense power of vision enabled him to see the reactions of chemicals more understandingly than the average student saw them in the laboratory. Martin wandered on through the heavy pages, overwhelmed by the clues he was getting to the nature of things. He had accepted the world as the world, but now he was comprehending the organization of it, the play and interplay of force and matter. Spontaneous explanations of old matters were continually arising in his mind. Levers and purchases fascinated him, and his mind roved backward to handspikes and blocks and tackles at sea. The theory of navigation, which enabled the ships to travel unerringly their courses over the pathless ocean, was made clear to him. The mysteries of storm and rain and tide were revealed, and the reason for the existence of trade winds made him wonder whether he had written his article on the northeast trade too soon. At any rate, he knew he could write it better now. One afternoon he went out with Arthur to the University of California and, with bated breath and a feeling of religious awe, went through the laboratories, saw demonstrations, and listened to a physics professor lecturing to his classes. But he did not neglect his writing. A stream of short stories flowed from his pen, and he branched out into the easier forms of verse, the kind he saw printed in the magazines, though he lost his head and wasted 2 weeks on a tragedy in blank verse, the swift rejection of which by 6 magazines dumbfounded him. Then he discovered Henley and wrote a series of sea poems on the model of hospital sketches. They were simple poems of light and colour and romance and adventure. Sea lyrics, he called them, and he judged them to be the best work he had yet done. There were 30, and he completed them in a month, doing one a day after having done his regular day's work on fiction, which day's work was the equivalent to a week's work of the average successful writer. The toil meant nothing to him. It was not toil. He was finding speech, and all the beauty and wonder that had been pent for years behind his inarticulate lips was now pouring forth in a wild and virile flood. He showed the sea lyrics to no one, not even to the editors. He had become distrustful of editors, but it was not distrust that prevented him from submitting the lyrics. They were so beautiful to him that he was impelled to save them to share with Ruth in some glorious far-off time when he would dare to read her what he had written. Against that time, he kept them with him, reading them aloud, going over them until he knew them by heart. He lived every moment of his waking hours, and he lived in his sleep. his subjective mind rioting through his first 5 hours of surcease and combining the thoughts and events of the day into grotesque and impossible marvels. In reality, he never rested, and a weaker body or a less firmly poised brain would have been prostrated in a general breakdown. His late afternoon calls on Ruth were rarer now, for June was approaching when she would take her degree and finish with the university, Bachelor of Arts. When he thought of her degree, it seemed she fled beyond him faster than he could pursue. 1 afternoon a week she gave to him, and, arriving late, he usually stayed for dinner and for music afterward. Those were his red-letter days, the atmosphere of the house in such contrast with that in which he lived. And the mere nearness to her sent him forth each time with a firmer grip on his resolve to climb the heights. In spite of the beauty in him and the aching desire to create, it was for her that he struggled. He was a lover first and always. All other things he subordinated to love. Greater than his adventure in the world of thought was his love adventure. The world itself was not so amazing because of the atoms and molecules that composed it according to the propulsions of irresistible force. What made it amazing was the fact that Ruth lived in it. She was the most amazing thing he had ever known, or dreamed, or guessed. But he was oppressed always by her remoteness. She was so far from him, and he did not know how to approach her. He had been a success with girls and women in his own class, but he had never loved any of them, while he did love her, and besides, she was not merely of another class. His very love elevated her above all classes. She was a being apart, so far apart that he did not know how to draw near to her as a lover should draw near. It was true, as he acquired knowledge and language, that he was drawing nearer, talking her speech, discovering her ideas and delights in common. But this did not satisfy his lover's yearning. His lover's imagination had made her holy, too spiritualized, to have any kinship with him in the flesh. It was his own love that thrust her from him and made her seem impossible for him. Love itself denied him the one thing that it desired. And then, one day, without warning, the gulf between them was bridged for a moment, and thereafter, though the gulf remained, it was ever narrower. They had been eating cherries, great, luscious black cherries with a juice of the colour of dark wine. And later, as she read aloud to him from The Princess, he chanced to notice the stain of the cherries on her lips. For the moment, her divinity was shattered. She was clay, after all, mere clay, subject to the common law of clay as his clay was subject, or anybody's clay. Her lips were fresh like his, and cherries dyed them as cherries dyed his. And if so with her lips, then was it so with all of her. She was woman, all woman, just like any woman. It came upon him abruptly. It was a revelation that stunned him. It was as if he had seen the sun fall out of the sky or had seen worshipped purity polluted. Then he realized the significance of it, and his heart began pounding and challenging him to play the lover with this woman who was not a spirit from other worlds, but a mere woman with lips a cherry could stain. He trembled at the audacity of his thought, but all his soul was singing, and reason in a triumphant paean assured him he was right. Something of this change in him must have reached her, for she paused from her reading, looked up at him, and smiled. His eyes dropped from her blue eyes to her lips, and the sight of the stain maddened him. His arms all but flashed out to her and around her, in the way of his old careless life. She seemed to lean toward him, to wait, and all his will fought to hold him back. "You were not following a word," she pouted. Then she laughed at him, delighting in his confusion, and as he looked into her frank eyes and knew that she had divined nothing of what he felt, he became abashed. He had indeed, in thought, dared too far. Of all the women he had known, there was no woman who would not have guessed, save her, and she had not guessed. There was the difference. She was different. He was appalled by his own grossness, awed by her clear innocence, and he gazed again at her across the gulf. The bridge had broken down. But still the incident had brought him nearer. The memory of it persisted, and in the moments when he was most cast down, he dwelt upon it eagerly. The gulf was never again so wide. He had accomplished a distance vastly greater than a bachelorship of arts, or a dozen bachelorships. She was pure, it was true, as he had never dreamed of purity, but cherries stained her lips. She was subject to the laws of the universe just as inexorably as he was. She had to eat to live, and when she got her feet wet, she caught cold. But that was not the point. If she could feel hunger and thirst, and heat and cold, then could she feel love, and love for a man. Well, he was a man, and why could not he be the man? "It's up to me to make good," he would murmur fervently. "I will be the man. I will make myself the man. I will make good." Chapter 12. Early one evening, struggling with a sonnet that twisted all awry the beauty and thought that trailed in glow and vapour through his brain, Martin was called to the telephone. "It's a lady's voice, a fine lady's," Mr. Higginbotham, who had called him, jeered. Martin went to the telephone in the corner of the room, and felt a wave of warmth rush through him as he heard Ruth's voice. In his battle with the sonnet, he had forgotten her existence, and at the sound of her voice his love for her smote him like a sudden blow. And such a voice! Delicate and sweet, like a strain of music heard far off and faint, or, better, like a bell of silver, a perfect tone, crystal pure. No mere woman had a voice like that. There was something celestial about it, and it came from other worlds. He could scarcely hear what it said, so ravished was he, though he controlled his face, for he knew that Mr. Higginbotham's ferret eyes were fixed upon him. It was not much that Ruth wanted to say, merely that Norman had been going to take her to a lecture that night, but that he had a headache, and she was so disappointed, and she had the tickets, and that if he had no other engagement, would he be good enough to take her? Would he? He fought to suppress the eagerness in his voice. It was amazing. He had always seen her in her own house, and he had never dared to ask her to go anywhere with him. Quite irrelevantly, still at the telephone and talking with her, he felt an overpowering desire to die for her, and visions of heroic sacrifice shaped and dissolved in his whirling brain. He loved her so much, so terribly, so hopelessly. In that moment of mad happiness that she should go out with him, go to a lecture with him, Martin Eden, she soared so far above him that there seemed nothing else for him to do than die for her. It was the only fit way in which he could express the tremendous and lofty emotion he felt for her. It was the sublime abnegation of true love that comes to all lovers. And it came to him there, at the telephone, in a whirlwind of fire and glory, and to die for her, he felt, was to have lived and loved well. And he was only 21, and he had never been in love before. His hand trembled as he hung up the receiver, and he was weak from the organ which had stirred him. His eyes were shining like an angel's, and his face was transfigured, purged of all earthly dross, and pure and holy. "Making dates outside, huh?" his brother-in-law sneered. "You know what that means. You'll be in the police court yet." But Martin could not come down from the height. Not even the bestiality of the illusion could bring him back to earth. Anger and hurt were beneath him. He had seen a great vision and was a god, and he could feel only profound and awful pity for this maggot of a man. He did not look at him, and though his eyes passed over him, he did not see him, and as in a dream he passed out of the room to dress. It was not until he had reached his own room and was tying his necktie that he became aware of a sound that lingered unpleasantly in his ears. On investigating this sound, he identified it as the final snort of Bernard Higginbotham, which somehow had not penetrated to his brain before. As Ruth's front door closed behind them, and he came down the steps with her, he found himself greatly perturbed. It was not unalloyed bliss, taking her to the lecture. He did not know what he ought to do. He had seen, on the streets, with persons of her class, that the women took the men's arms. But then, again, he had seen them when they didn't, and he wondered if it was only in the evening that arms were taken, or only between husbands and wives and relatives. Just before he reached the sidewalk, he remembered Minnie. Minnie had always been a stickler. She had called him down the second time she walked out with him, because he had gone along on the inside, and she had laid the law down to him that a gentleman always walked on the outside, when he was with a lady. And Minnie had made a practice of kicking his heels whenever they crossed from one side of the street to the other, to remind him to get over on the outside. He wondered where she had got that item of etiquette, and whether it had filtered down from above and was all right. It wouldn't do any harm to try it, he decided, by the time they had reached the sidewalk, and he swung behind Ruth and took up his station on the outside. Then the other problem presented itself. Should he offer her his arm? He had never offered anybody his arm in his life. The girls he had known never took the fellow's arms. For the first several times they walked freely, side by side, and after that it was arms around the waists, and heads against the fellow's shoulders where the streets were unlighted. But this was different. She wasn't that kind of a girl. He must do something. He crooked the arm next to her, crooked it very slightly and with secret tentativeness, not invitingly, but just casually, as though he was accustomed to walk that way. And then the wonderful thing happened. He felt her hand upon his arm. Delicious thrills ran through him at the contact, and for a few sweet moments it seemed that he had left the solid earth and was flying with her through the air. But he was soon back again, perturbed by a new complication. They were crossing the street. This would put him on the inside. He should be on the outside. Should he therefore drop her arm and change over? And if he did so, would he have to repeat the manoeuvre the next time? And the next? There was something wrong about it, and he resolved not to caper about and play the fool. Yet he was not satisfied with his conclusion, and when he found himself on the inside, he talked quickly and earnestly, making a show of being carried away by what he was saying, so that in case he was wrong in not changing sides, his enthusiasm would seem the cause for his carelessness. As they crossed Broadway, he came face to face with a new problem. In the blaze of the electric lights, he saw Lizzie Connolly and her giggly friend. Only for an instant he hesitated. Then his hand went up and his hat came off. He could not be disloyal to his kind, and it was to more than Lizzie Connolly that his hat was lifted. She nodded and looked at him boldly, not with soft and gentle eyes like Ruth's, but with eyes that were handsome and hard, and that swept on past him to Ruth and itemized her face and dress and station. And he was aware that Ruth looked, too, with quick eyes that were timid and mild as a dove's, but which saw in a look that was a flutter on and past the working-class girl in her cheap finery and under the strange hat that all working-class girls were wearing just then. "What a pretty girl," Ruth said a moment later. Martin could have blessed her, though he said, "I don't know. I guess it's all a matter of personal taste. But she doesn't strike me as being particularly pretty. Why, there isn't one woman in 10,000 with features as regular as hers. They are splendid. Her face is as clear-cut as a cameo, and her eyes are beautiful." "Do you think so?" Martin queried absently, for to him there was only one beautiful woman in the world, and she was beside him, her hand upon his arm. "Do I think so? If that girl had proper opportunity to dress, Mr. Eaton, and if she were taught how to carry herself, you would be fairly dazzled by her, and so would all men." "She would have to be taught how to speak," he commented, "or else most of the men wouldn't understand her. I'm sure you couldn't understand a quarter of what she said if she just spoke naturally." "Nonsense! You are as bad as Arthur when you try to make your point." "You forget how I talked when you first met me. I have learned a new language since then. Before that time I talked as that girl talks. Now I can manage to make myself understood sufficiently in your language to explain that you do not know that other girl's language. And do you know why she carries herself the way she does? I think about such things now, though I never used to think about them, and I'm beginning to understand much." "But why does she?" "She has worked long hours for years at machines. When one's body is young, it is very pliable, and hard work will mold it like putty according to the nature of the work. I can tell at a glance the trades of many working men I meet on the street. Look at me. Why am I rolling all about the shop? Because of the years I put in on the sea. If I'd put in the same years cowpunching, with my body young and pliable, I wouldn't be rolling now, but I'd be bow-legged. And so with that girl. You notice that her eyes were what I might call hard. She has never been sheltered. She has had to take care of herself, and a young girl can't take care of herself and keep her eyes soft and gentle like yours, for example." "I think you're right," Ruth said in a low voice, "and it's too bad. She's such a pretty girl." He looked at her and saw her eyes luminous with pity, and then he remembered that he loved her and was lost in amazement at his fortune that permitted him to love her and to take her on his arm to a lecture. "Who are you, Martin Eden?" he demanded of himself in the looking-glass that night when he got back to his room. He gazed at himself long and curiously. "Who are you? What are you? Where do you belong? You belong by rights to girls like Lizzie Connolly. You belong with the legions of toil, with all that is low and vulgar and unbeautiful. You belong with the oxen and the drudges in dirty surroundings among smells and stenches. There are the stale vegetables now. Those potatoes are rotting. Smell them, damn you, smell them. And yet you dare to open the books, to listen to beautiful music, to learn to love beautiful paintings, to speak good English, to think thoughts that none of your own kind thinks, to tear yourself away from the oxen and the Lizzie Connollys, and to love a pale spirit of a woman who is 1,000,000 miles beyond you and who lives in the stars. Who are you, and what are you, damn you? And are you going to make good?" He shook his fist at himself in the glass and sat down on the edge of the bed to dream for a space with wide eyes. Then he got out notebook and algebra and lost himself in quadratic equations while the hours slipped by and the stars dimmed and the grey of the dawn flooded against his window. Chapter 13. It was the knot of wordy socialists and working-class philosophers that held forth in the City Hall Park on warm afternoons that was responsible for the great discovery. Once or twice in the month, while riding through the park on his way to the library, Martin dismounted from his wheel and listened to the arguments, and each time he tore himself away reluctantly. The tone of discussion was much lower than at Mr. Morse's table. The men were not grave and dignified. They lost their tempers easily and called one another names, while oaths and obscene allusions were frequent on their lips. Once or twice he had seen them come to blows, and yet he knew not why there seemed something vital about the stuff of these men's thoughts. Their logomachy was far more stimulating to his intellect than the reserved and quiet dogmatism of Mr. Morse. These men, who slaughtered English, gesticulated like lunatics, and fought one another's ideas with primitive anger, seemed somehow to be more alive than Mr. Morse and his crony, Mr. Butler. Martin had heard Herbert Spencer quoted several times in the park, but one afternoon a disciple of Spencer's appeared, a seedy tramp with a dirty coat buttoned tightly to the throat to conceal the absence of a shirt. Battle royal was waged amid the smoking of many cigarettes and the expectoration of much tobacco juice, wherein the tramp successfully held his own, even when a socialist workman sneered, "There is no God but the unknowable, and Herbert Spencer is his prophet." Martin was puzzled as to what the discussion was about, but when he rode on to the library he carried with him a newborn interest in Herbert Spencer, and because of the frequency with which the tramp had mentioned First Principles, Martin drew out that volume. So the great discovery began. Once before he had tried Spencer, and choosing the Principles of Psychology to begin with, he had failed as abjectly as he had failed with Madame Blavatsky. There had been no understanding the book, and he had returned it unread. But this night, after algebra and physics, and an attempt at a sonnet, he got into bed and opened First Principles. Morning found him still reading. It was impossible for him to sleep, nor did he write that day. He lay on the bed till his body grew tired, when he tried the hard floor, reading on his back, the book held in the air above him, or changing from side to side. He slept that night, and did his writing next morning, and then the book tempted him, and he fell reading all afternoon, oblivious to everything and oblivious to the fact that that was the afternoon Ruth gave to him. His first consciousness of the immediate world about him was when Bernard Higginbotham jerked open the door and demanded to know if he thought they were running a restaurant. Martin Eden had been mastered by curiosity all his days. He wanted to know, and it was this desire that had sent him adventuring over the world. But he was now learning from Spencer that he never had known, and that he never could have known had he continued his sailing and wandering forever. He had merely skimmed over the surface of things, observing detached phenomena, accumulating fragments of facts, making superficial little generalizations, and all and everything quite unrelated in a capricious and disorderly world of whim and chance. The mechanism of the flight of birds he had watched and reasoned about with understanding, but it had never entered his head to try to explain the process whereby birds, as organic flying mechanisms, had been developed. He had never dreamed there was such a process. That birds should have come to be was unguessed. They always had been. They just happened. And as it was with birds, so had it been with everything. His ignorant and unprepared attempts at philosophy had been fruitless. The medieval metaphysics of Kant had given him the key to nothing, and had served the sole purpose of making him doubt his own intellectual powers. In similar manner, his attempt to study evolution had been confined to a hopelessly technical volume by Romans. He had understood nothing, and the only idea he had gathered was that evolution was a dry-as-dust theory, of a lot of little men possessed of huge and unintelligible vocabularies. And now he learned that evolution was no mere theory, but an accepted process of development, that scientists no longer disagreed about it, their only differences being over the method of evolution. And here was the man Spencer, organizing all knowledge for him, reducing everything to unity, elaborating ultimate realities, and presenting to his startled gaze a universe so concrete of realization that it was like the model of a ship which, as sailors make and put into glass bottles. There was no caprice, no chance. All was law. It was in obedience to law that the bird flew, and it was in obedience to the same law that fermenting slime had writhed and squirmed and put out legs and wings and become a bird. Martin had ascended from pitch to pitch of intellectual living, and here he was at a higher pitch than ever. All the hidden things were laying their secrets bare. He was drunken with comprehension. At night, asleep, he lived with the gods in colossus nightmare. And awake in the day, he went around like a somnambulist, with absent stare, gazing upon the world he had just discovered. At table, he failed to hear the conversation about petty and ignoble things, his eager mind seeking out and following cause and effect in everything before him. In the meat on the platter, he saw the shining sun, and traced its energy back through all its transformations to its source 100 million miles away, or traced its energy ahead to the moving muscles in the arms that enabled him to cut the meat, and to the brain, wherewith he willed the muscles to move to cut the meat, until, with inward gaze, he saw the same sun shining in his brain. He was entranced by illumination, and did not hear the bug-house whispered by Jim, nor see the anxiety on his sister's face, nor notice the rotary motion of Bernard Higginbotham's finger, whereby he imparted the suggestion of wheels revolving in his brother-in-law's head. What, in a way, most profoundly impressed Martin was the correlation of knowledge, of all knowledge. He had been curious to know things, and whatever he acquired he had filed away in separate memory compartments in his brain. Thus, on the subject of sailing, he had an immense store. On the subject of women, he had a fairly large store. But these two subjects had been unrelated. Between the two memory compartments there had been no connection. That, in the fabric of knowledge, there should be any connection whatever between a woman with hysterics and a schooner carrying a weather helm or heaving to in a gale would have struck him as ridiculous and impossible. But Herbert Spencer had shown him not only that it was not ridiculous, but that it was impossible for there to be no connection. All things were related to all other things, from the farthermost star in the wastes of space to the myriads of atoms in the grain of sand under one's foot. This new concept was a perpetual amazement to Martin, and he found himself engaged continually in tracing the relationship between all things under the sun and on the other side of the sun. He drew up lists of the most incongruous things and was unhappy until he succeeded in establishing kinship between them all. Kinship between love, poetry, earthquake, fire, rattlesnakes, rainbows, precious gems, monstrosities, sunsets, the roaring of lions, illuminating gas, cannibalism, beauty, murder, lovers, fulcrums, and tobacco. Thus he unified the universe and held it up and looked at it, or wandered through the byways and alleys and jungles, and as a terrified traveller in the thick of mysteries, seeking an unknown goal, but observing and charting and becoming familiar with all there was to know. And the more he knew, the more passionately he admired the universe, and life, and his own life in the midst of it all. "You fool!" he cried at his image in the looking-glass. "You wanted to write, and you tried to write, and you had nothing in you to write about. What did you have in you? Some childish notions, a few half-baked sentiments, a lot of undigested beauty, a great black mass of ignorance, a heart filled to bursting with love, and an ambition as big as your love and as futile as your ignorance. And you wanted to write. Why, you're just on the edge of beginning to get something in you to write about. You wanted to create beauty, but how could you when you knew nothing about the nature of beauty? You wanted to write about life when you knew nothing of the essential characteristics of life. You wanted to write about the world and the scheme of existence, when the world was a Chinese puzzle to you, and all that you could have written would have been about what you did not know of the scheme of existence. But cheer up, Martin, my boy. You'll write yet. You know a little, a very little, and you're on the right road to know more. Some day, if you're lucky, you may come pretty close to knowing all that may be known. Then you will write." He brought his great discovery to Ruth, sharing with her all his joy and wonder in it, but she did not seem to be so enthusiastic over it. She tactically accepted it and, in a way, seemed aware of it from her own studies. It did not stir her deeply, as it did him, and he would have been surprised had he not reasoned it out that it was not new and fresh to her as it was to him. Arthur and Norman, he found, believed in evolution and had read Spencer, though it did not seem to have made any vital impression upon them, while the young fellow with the glasses and the mop of hair, Will Olney, sneered disagreeably at Spencer and repeated the epigram, "There is no God but the unknowable, and Herbert Spencer is his prophet." But Martin forgave him the sneer, for he had begun to discover that Olney was not in love with Ruth. Later, he was dumbfounded to learn from various little happenings not only that Olney did not care for Ruth, but that he had a positive dislike for her. Martin could not understand this. It was a bit of a phenomena that he could not correlate with all the rest of the phenomena in the universe, but nevertheless he felt sorry for the young fellow because of the great lack in his nature that prevented him from a proper appreciation of Ruth's fineness and beauty. They rode out into the hills several Sundays on their wheels, and Martin had ample opportunity to observe the armed truce that existed between Ruth and Olney. The latter chummed with Norman, throwing Arthur and Martin into company with Ruth, for which Martin was duly grateful. Those Sundays were great days for Martin, greatest because he was with Ruth, and great also because they were putting him more on a par with the young men of her class. In spite of their long years of disciplined education, he was finding himself their intellectual equal, and the hours spent with them in conversation was so much practice for him in the use of the grammar he had studied so hard. He had abandoned the etiquette books, falling back upon observation to show him the right things to do. Except when carried away by his enthusiasm, he was always on guard, keenly watchful of their actions and learning their little courtesies and refinements of conduct. The fact that Spencer was very little read was for some time a source of surprise to Martin. "Herbert Spencer," said the man at the desk in the library. "Oh, yes, a great mind." But the man did not seem to know anything of the content of that great mind. One evening, at dinner, when Mr. Butler was there, Martin turned the conversation upon Spencer. Mr. Morse bitterly arraigned the English philosopher's agnosticism, but confessed that he had not read First Principles, while Mr. Butler stated that he had no patience with Spencer, had never read a line of him, and had managed to get along quite well without him. Doubts arose in Martin's mind, and had he been less strongly individual, he would have accepted the general opinion and given Herbert Spencer up. As it was, he found Spencer's explanation of things convincing, and, as he phrased it to himself, to give up Spencer would be equivalent to a navigator throwing the compass and chronometer overboard. So Martin went on into a thorough study of evolution, mastering more and more the subject himself, and being convinced by the corroborative testimony of 1,000 independent writers. The more he studied, the more vistas he caught of fields of knowledge yet unexplored, and the regret that days were only 24 hours long became a chronic complaint with him. One day, because the days were so short, he decided to give up algebra and geometry. Trigonometry he had not even attempted. Then he cut chemistry from his study list, retaining only physics. "I am not a specialist," he said in defense to Ruth, "nor am I going to try to be a specialist. There are too many special fields for any one man in a whole lifetime to master a tithe of them. I must pursue general knowledge. When I need the work of specialists, I shall refer to their books." "But that is not like having the knowledge yourself," she protested. "But it is unnecessary to have it. We profit from the work of the specialists. That's what they are for. When I came in, I noticed the chimney sweeps at work. They're specialists, and when they get done, you will enjoy clean chimneys without knowing anything about the construction of chimneys." "That's far-fetched, I'm afraid." She looked at him curiously, and he felt a reproach in her gaze and manner, but he was convinced of the rightness of his position. All thinkers on general subjects, the greatest minds in the world, in fact, rely on the specialists. Herbert Spencer did that. He generalized upon the findings of thousands of investigators. He would have had to live 1,000 lives in order to do it all himself. And so with Darwin. He took advantage of all that had been learned by the florists and cattle breeders. "You're right, Martin," Olney said. "You know what you're after, and Ruth doesn't. She doesn't know what she is after for herself, even." "Oh, yes," Olney rushed on, heading off her objection. "I know you call it general culture, but it doesn't matter what you study if you want general culture. You can study French, or you can study German, or cut them both out and study Esperanto. You'll get the culture tone just the same. You can study Greek or Latin too, for the same purpose, though it will never be any use to you. It will be culture, though. Why, Ruth studied Saxon, became clever in it. That was 2 years ago, and all that she remembers of it now is "Quando sweet April with his showers sot." Isn't that the way it goes? But it's given you the culture tone just the same, he laughed, again heading her off. "I know, we were in the same classes." "But you speak of culture as if it should be a means to something," Ruth cried out. Her eyes were flashing, and in her cheeks were 2 spots of colour. "Culture is the end in itself." "But that is not what Martin wants." "How do you know?" "What do you want, Martin?" Olney demanded, turning squarely upon him. Martin felt very uncomfortable and looked entreaty at Ruth. "Yes, what do you want?" Ruth asked. "That will settle it." "Yes, of course I want culture," Martin faltered. "I love beauty, and culture will give me a finer and keener appreciation of beauty." She nodded her head and looked triumph. "Right, and you know it," was Onley's comment. "Martin's after career, not culture. It just happens that culture, in his case, is incidental to career. If he wanted to be a chemist, culture would be unnecessary. Martin wants to write, but he's afraid to say so because it will put you in the wrong." "And why does Martin want to write?" he went on. "Because he isn't rolling in wealth. Why do you fill your head with Saxon and general culture? Because you don't have to make your way in the world. Your father sees to that. He buys your clothes for you and all the rest. What rotten good is our education, yours and mine and Arthur's and Norman's, was soaked in general culture, and if our daddies went broke today, we'd be falling down tomorrow on teachers' examinations. The best job you could get, Ruth, would be a country school or music teacher in a girls' boarding school." "And pray, what would you do?" she asked. "Not a blessed thing. I could earn $1.50 a day, common labor, and I might get in as instructor in Handley's cramming joint. I say might, mind you, and I might be chucked out at the end of the week for sheer inability." Martin followed the discussion closely, and while he was convinced that Olney was right, he resented the rather cavalier treatment he accorded Ruth. A new conception of love formed in his mind as he listened. Reason had nothing to do with love. It mattered not whether the woman he loved reasoned correctly or incorrectly. Love was above reason. If it just happened that she did not fully appreciate his necessity for a career, that did not make her a bit less lovable. She was all lovable, and what she thought had nothing to do with her lovableness. "What's that?" he replied to a question from Olney that broke in upon his train of thought. "I was saying that I hoped you wouldn't be fool enough to tackle Latin." "But Latin is more than culture," Ruth broke in. "It is equipment." "Well, are you going to tackle it?" Olney persisted. Martin was sore beset. He could see that Ruth was hanging eagerly upon his answer. "I am afraid I won't have time," he said finally. "I'd like to, but I won't have time." "You see, Martin's not seeking culture," Olney exulted. "He's trying to get somewhere, to do something." "Oh, but it's mental training. It's mind discipline. It's what makes disciplined minds." Ruth looked expectantly at Martin, as if waiting for him to change his judgment. You know, the football players have to train before the big game, and that is what Latin does for the thinker. It trains. Rot and bosh. That's what they told us when we were kids. But there is one thing they didn't tell us. They let us find it out for ourselves afterwards. Only paused for effect, then added, and what they didn't tell us was that every gentleman should have studied Latin, but that no gentleman should know Latin. Now that's unfair, Ruth cried. I knew you were turning the conversation just in order to get off something. It's clever, all right, was the retort, but it's fair, too. The only men who know their Latin are the apothecaries, the lawyers, and the Latin professors. And if Martin wants to be one of them, I miss my guess. But what's all that got to do with Herbert Spencer, anyway? Martin's just discovered Spencer, and he's wild over him. Why? Because Spencer is taking him somewhere. Spencer couldn't take me anywhere, nor you. We haven't got anywhere to go. You'll get married someday, and I'll have nothing to do but keep track of the lawyers and business agents who will take care of the money my father's going to leave me. Only got up to go, but turned at the door and delivered a parting shot. You leave Martin alone, Ruth. He knows what's best for himself. Look at what he's done already. He makes me sick sometimes, sick and ashamed of myself. He knows more about the world and life and man's place and all the rest than Arthur or Norman or I or you too, for that matter, and in spite of all our Latin and French and Saxon and culture. But Ruth is my teacher, Martin answered chivalrously. She is responsible for what little I have learned. Rats! Only looked at Ruth, and his expression was malicious. I suppose you'll be telling me next that you read Spencer on her recommendation, only you didn't. And she doesn't know anything more about Darwin and evolution than I do about King Solomon's mines. What's that jawbreaker definition about something or other of Spencer's that you sprang on us the other day? That indefinite, incoherent, homogeneity thing? Spring it on her and see if she understands a word of it. That isn't culture, you see. Well, tra-la, and if you tackle Latin, Martin, I won't have any respect for you. And all the while, interested in the discussion, Martin had been aware of an irk in it as well. It was about studies and lessons, dealing with the rudiments of knowledge, and the schoolboyish tone of it conflicted with the big things that were stirring in him, with the grip upon life that was even then crooking his fingers like eagle's talons, with the cosmic thrills that made him ache, and with the inchoate consciousness of mastery of it all. He likened himself to a poet, wrecked on the shores of a strange land, filled with power of beauty, stumbling and stammering and vainly trying to sing in the rough barbaric tongue of his brethren in the new land. And so with him. He was alive, painfully alive, to the great universal things, and yet he was compelled to potter and grope among schoolboy topics, and debate whether or not he should study Latin. What the hell has Latin to do with it? He demanded before his mirror that night. I wish dead people would stay dead. Why should I and the beauty in me be ruled by the dead? Beauty is alive and everlasting. Languages come and go. They are the dust of the dead. And his next thought was that he had been phrasing his ideas very well, and he went to bed wondering why he could not talk in similar fashion when he was with Ruth. He was only a schoolboy with a schoolboy's tongue when he was in her presence. Give me time, he said aloud. Only give me time. Time, 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 was his unending plaint. Chapter 14. It was not because of Olney, but in spite of Ruth and his love for Ruth, that he finally decided not to take up Latin. His money meant time. There was so much that was more important than Latin, so many studies that clamoured with imperious voices. And he must write. He must earn money. He had had no acceptances. 200 of manuscripts were travelling the endless round of the magazines. How did the others do it? He spent long hours in the free reading room, going over what others had written, studying their work eagerly and critically, comparing it with his own, and wondering about the secret trick they had discovered which enabled them to sell their work. He was amazed at the immense amount of printed stuff that was dead. No light, no life, no colour was shot through it. There was no breath of life in it, and yet it sold at 2 cents a word, $20 1,000. The newspaper clipping had said so. He was puzzled by countless short stories, written lightly and cleverly, he confessed, but without vitality or reality. Life was so strange and wonderful, filled with an immensity of problems, of dreams, and of heroic toils, and yet these stories dealt only with the commonplaces of life. He felt the stress and strain of life, its fevers and sweats and wild insurgencies. Surely this was the stuff to write about. He wanted to glorify the leaders of forlorn hopes, the mad lovers, the giants that fought under stress and strain, amid terror and tragedy, making life crackle with the strength of their endeavour. And yet the magazine short stories seemed intent on glorifying the Mr. Butlers, the sordid dollar chasers, and the commonplace little love affairs of commonplace little men and women. Was it because the editors of the magazines were commonplace, he demanded, or were they afraid of life, these writers and editors and readers? But his chief trouble was that he did not know any editors or writers. And not merely did he not know any writers, but he did not know anybody who had ever attempted to write. There was nobody to tell him, to hint to him, to give him the least word of advice. He began to doubt that editors were real men. They seemed cogs in a machine. That was what it was, a machine. He poured his soul into stories, articles, and poems, and entrusted them to the machine. He folded them just so, put the proper stamps inside the long envelope, along with the manuscript, sealed the envelope, put more stamps outside, and dropped it into the mailbox. It travelled across the continent, and after a certain lapse of time, the postman returned him the manuscript in another long envelope, on the outside of which were the stamps he had enclosed. There was no human editor at the other end, but a mere cunning arrangement of cogs that changed the manuscript from one envelope to another and stuck on the stamps. It was like the slot machines wherein one dropped pennies and, with the metallic whirl of machinery, had delivered to him a stick of chewing gum or a tablet of chocolate. It depended upon which slot one dropped the penny in, whether he got chocolate or gum. And so with the editorial machine. One slot brought checks and the other brought rejection slips. So far, he had found only the latter slot. It was the rejection slips that completed the horrible machine-likeness of the process. These slips were printed in stereotyped forms, and he had received hundreds of them, as many as a dozen or more on each of his earlier manuscripts. If he had received one line, one personal line, along with one rejection of all his rejections, he would have been cheered. But not one editor had given that proof of existence, and he could conclude only that there were no warm human men at the other end, only mere cogs, well-oiled and running beautifully in the machine. He was a good fighter, whole-souled and stubborn, and he would have been content to continue feeding the machine for years. But he was bleeding to death, and not years but weeks would determine the fight. Each week his board bill brought him nearer destruction, while the postage on 40 manuscripts bled him almost as severely. He no longer bought books, and he economized in petty ways and sought to delay the inevitable end.